25%. That is the exact amount of your brain's hardware that was actually installed and running on the day you were born. To any other creature on Earth, that number sounds like a death sentence. A baby wildebeest is standing and running within minutes of hitting the grass because if it isn't, the story ends right there. A baby macaque can cling to its mother's back and navigate the canopy almost immediately. But when you arrived, you were effectively a biological paperweight. You couldn't hold up your own head, you couldn't find your own food, and you couldn't even move away from a threat. For nearly all of human history, that 25% was the most dangerous statistic in the world. It meant that every single human infant was a massive, high-stakes gamble against a planet that was actively trying to kill it. We like to think of ancient parenting as a brutal, every-man-for-himself struggle, but the reality is far stranger. To keep that helpless 25% alive long enough to grow into a person, our ancestors had to rewrite the rules of biology itself. They didn't just survive. They engineered a system of communal protection that makes our modern, nuclear family look like a lonely experiment. The story of how you actually got here begins millions of years ago with a trade-off that nearly wiped us out before we even started. This trade-off was sparked by a change in how we moved. When our ancestors stood up on two legs, it fundamentally redesigned the human body. To walk efficiently, our pelvises had to become narrower and more compact. At the same time, our brains were starting to explode in size. This created what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma. If a human baby stayed in the womb until its brain was as developed as a chimpanzee's, it would be physically impossible for it to be born. The head would simply be too large for the narrow, bipedal birth canal. So, evolution struck a desperate bargain. We began giving birth to extrauterine fetuses. We started having babies that were born 9 months early compared to other primates. We are the only species that requires a 4th trimester outside the body. This meant that the earliest human campfires weren't just for cooking. They were the first mechanical incubators. Jeremy De Silva, a prominent paleoanthropologist, has pointed out that human birth is a rotational event, a complex dance where the baby has to turn to fit through the pelvis. This meant that, unlike almost any other animal, human mothers couldn't easily give birth alone. They needed midwives millions of years ago. The very act of entering the world became a social event. That first spark of the communal fire was lit not for warmth, but because the biological cost of our intelligence made us entirely dependent on each other from the very first breath. As we move forward into the era of early Homo sapiens, about 200,000 years ago, that single spark of assistance grew into a massive, roaring hearth of social cooperation. Because the human infant was so helpless for so long, the burden of keeping it alive was too much for any one woman to carry. In a world of leopards and fluctuating climates, a mother who tried to go it alone was a mother who lost her child. This is where we see the rise of what Sarah Blaffer HRDY calls cooperative breeding. In these ancient groups, the ember of care was passed from hand to hand. It wasn't just the mother holding the baby. It was the aunts, the older siblings, the cousins, and the grandmothers. Research into modern hunter-gatherer groups like the F of Central Africa gives us a window into this deep-time reality. Among the F, a newborn is held by someone other than its mother for roughly 60% of the day. By the time a child is 3 weeks old, it is being cared for by an average of 14 different people. This constant passing of the child was a survival technology. It allowed the mother to forage and recover her own strength, while the child remained in a glow of constant protection. If a predator approached, there were 10 pairs of eyes watching the grass, not just one. This shared labor transformed the human infant from a liability into a shared investment for the entire tribe. This communal glow did more than just keep the baby safe. It fundamentally changed how our brains developed during that crucial first year. While the baby was being passed from hand to hand, its brain was rapidly trying to figure out who all these people were. This is likely why humans developed joint attention, the ability to look at what someone else is looking at. We became the most socially intelligent creatures on Earth because we had to be. We had to charm our caretakers to ensure they kept feeding us. In the Upper Paleolithic, around 50,000 years ago, we see this investment in children reaching incredible levels of complexity. We find evidence of slings, or baby carriers made from animal hides and plant fibers. While the physical materials have long since rotted away, we find the ghosts of these tools in the form of decorated beads and ornaments found in infant burials. At sites like the Sungir burial in Russia, children were buried with thousands of ivory beads and elaborate clothing that would have taken hundreds of hours to create. This wasn't just a grieving family, it was a society signaling that even a child who had contributed nothing to the hunt was a priceless member of the group. The embers of the hearth were no longer just for warmth. They were being used to forge an identity for the next generation before they could even speak. But then, about 15,000 years ago, the fire we had built for our children began to change. As humans transitioned from wandering foragers to settled farmers, the agricultural revolution created a massive paradox. On the surface, there was more food, which should have made keeping children alive easier. But bioarchaeologists like Sion Halcrow, who studies ancient infant remains, have found a different story written in the bones. When we settled down and started living in permanent villages with domesticated animals, infant mortality actually spiked. The fire became smokier and more confined. Living in close quarters with animals introduced a host of new diseases, smallpox, measles, and influenza, that ancient nomadic infants had never faced. Furthermore, the shift to grain-based diets meant that mothers were weaning their babies onto starchy porridges rather than the nutrient-dense wild foods of the past. We see enamel hypoplasia in the teeth of these ancient children, lines of arrested growth that show exactly when the child was struggling with malnutrition or infection. To combat this, ancient parents had to innovate again. This is the era where we see the first baby bottles. In 2019, researcher Julie Dunn analyzed small, spout-shaped clay vessels found in child graves in Germany. They contained residues of milk from cattle and goats. We were trying to supplement the mother's milk to keep the children alive in a world that was becoming increasingly crowded and toxic. This shift to animal milk was a double-edged sword. It allowed mothers to wean children earlier, which meant they could have more babies more quickly, leading to a population boom. But it also exposed infants to contaminated milk and new pathogens. The fire of the hearth was now a site of intense struggle. To survive this period, humans had to lean even harder into the grandmother hypothesis. This is the scientific theory, championed by Kristen Hawkes, that explains why human women live so long after they stop being able to reproduce. In almost every other species, life ends when reproduction ends. But human grandmothers stayed alive to provide the heat that the new agricultural system was lacking. They were the ones who could process the tough grains, watch the toddlers while the mothers worked the fields, and provide the supplemental care that kept the mortality rates from collapsing the species. The grandmothers were the keepers of the embers, ensuring that even when the diet was poor and the diseases were rampant, the knowledge of how to heal and how to nourish was passed down. Your existence today is the direct result of an old woman 10,000 years ago who didn't give up when the crop failed and the baby fell ill. The chronological journey of our species is a long march of moving the fire from the open wilderness into the closed rooms of the modern day. For 99% of our history, the village wasn't a metaphor, it was a biological requirement. The human child was designed to be raised in a high-touch, multi-adult environment where the 25% brain was constantly stimulated by a variety of voices and faces. But as we move into the industrial and modern era, we have done something that would have been unthinkable to our ancestors. We have moved the baby into a room by itself. We have created the nuclear family, where 1 or 2 adults are expected to do the work that was previously done by 15. We have replaced the 14 pairs of hands with plastic monitors and self-soothing techniques. The modern parent sitting alone in the dark at 4 a.m. isn't failing because they are weak. They are struggling because they are trying to defy 300,000 years of evolutionary programming. Your body and your baby's brain are still expecting the glow of the communal hearth, the presence of the grandmothers, and the passing of the child from hand to hand. We have specialized our lives so much that we have forgotten that we are cooperative breeders. When we look back at the deep time history of how we kept our children alive, the most surprising fact isn't that they used animal milk or skin slings. The most surprising fact is that they never, ever did it alone. The privacy we value so much today would have looked like a death sentence to an ancient mother. The isolation of the modern nursery is a radical, unproven departure from the way every single one of your successful ancestors lived. We are the survivors of the 25% gamble because for eons, the collective heat of the group was enough to bridge the gap between birth and independence. We traded our physical independence at birth for a massive brain, but that brain was only possible because we had already built the social structures to support it. The history of human parenting is not a history of individual grit, it is a history of communal surrender. We gave up the ability to survive alone so that we could become something more than just another primate. We became the species that carries each other's burdens, literally and figuratively, until those burdens are strong enough to walk on their own. Think back to that original image. The first rotational birth, the first time a group of humans gathered around a mother to do what she couldn't do by herself. That moment defined us more than the invention of the wheel or the taming of fire. It was the moment we decided that the most helpless thing in the world was also the most valuable. Every time you see a parent today struggling in silence, you are seeing the friction between our deep time past and our isolated present. The embers of our ancestral care are still there, buried under the layers of modern convenience, but they are getting harder to find. We have built a world that is safer in 1,000 ways, with vaccines, climate control, and abundant calories, but we have also built a world that is lonelier for the very creatures we are trying to protect. Our ancestors knew something that we are only just starting to remember. A child cannot grow in a vacuum. It needs the heat of the many to survive the cold of the world. The long arc of our history shows that we didn't survive because we were the toughest or the most aggressive. We survived because we were the most willing to share the weight of a helpless infant. From the 4th trimester of the Paleolithic to the clay bottles of the Neolithic, the goal has always been the same: to buy enough time for that 25% brain to reach its full potential. That potential is what allowed us to eventually leave the caves, build the cities, and even look back at our own history. But we must remember that the brain that can understand the stars is the same brain that, at 3 months old, would have died if it hadn't been held by a dozen different people. We are a social species not by choice, but by biological necessity. The hearth isn't just where we cooked our meat, it's where we forged our humanity, one child at a time, across hundreds of thousands of years of darkness. So, as we bring this journey to the present day, it's worth asking what we've lost in our pursuit of the perfect modern home. We have all the technology in the world, yet we have higher rates of parental burnout and postpartum depression than almost any society in history. We are trying to run ancient software on a modern, isolated operating system, and the hardware is starting to glitch. The history of how ancient humans kept their children alive is a reminder that you were never supposed to have all the answers. You were never supposed to be the only one holding the baby. You are part of a long, unbroken chain of others who stepped in when the mother was tired, who fed the child when the father was away, and who kept the fire burning through the longest nights of prehistory. If you could travel back to a camp 30,000 years ago, you wouldn't find a nursery. You would find a chaotic, loud, smoky, and crowded space where no one slept alone and no one ate alone. You would find a child being passed from an aunt to a grandfather to a teenager, all while the mother slept or worked or simply breathed. That chaos was the safest place in the world. It was the only place where a human infant could actually thrive. We have traded that chaos for quiet, and we have traded that crowd for privacy. But as the sun sets on our modern world, the silence in our homes tells a story that our ancestors would find terrifying. They knew that the dark was full of things that liked the silence, and they knew that the only way to keep the next generation alive was to never stop talking, never stop touching, and never stop passing the ember. It is a strange realization that our greatest strength as a species is our initial weakness. Our total dependence on one another is what forced us to become human. Without that helpless 25% brain, we would never have needed to invent language or art or the complex social networks that now span the globe. Our vulnerability was the catalyst for our greatness. But that greatness has a price, and that price is the constant need for community. We are the children of the village, even when the village is nowhere to be found. We carry the biological expectation of a crowd in our very DNA, And when we find ourselves alone, we feel it like a physical ache. That ache is the voice of 30,000 generations of ancestors telling us that we've wandered too far from the fire. The story of human survival is not a story of the lone hero. It is a story of the grandmother who dug the extra tuber, the sister who held the crying baby so the mother could sleep, and the neighbor who watched the tree lean while the village worked. It is a story of 1,000 small acts of cooperation that added up to the survival of a species. We are here because they refused to let the fire go out, and they refused to let any one person carry the weight of the future by themselves. They understood that the smallest among them was the most important, and they acted accordingly for 300,000 years. As we look at our own lives and our own families, we have to decide how we are going to keep the fire alive for the children of the future. Will we continue the experiment of the isolated nuclear family, or will we find new ways to rebuild the village in a digital age? The biological reality hasn't changed. The human infant is still born with only 25% of its brain ready. It still needs the fourth trimester. It still needs the transport response and the communal glow. We can change our houses and our jobs, but we cannot change the fundamental requirements of our species. We are built for connection, and our children are the living proof of that fact. If you ever find yourself wondering how our ancestors did it, just look at the nearest group of people. They did it by being there. They did it by refusing to be alone. They did it by understanding that a child belongs to the future, and the future is something we all have to build together. That is the true secret of human survival. It wasn't a special food or a hidden technique, it was the simple, radical act of staying together. And as we face the challenges of the 21st century, that ancient lesson is more important than ever. The fire is still there, waiting for us to gather around it once again. We have spent thousands of years trying to build a world where our children are safe from the elements, the predators, and the hunger of the wild. We have succeeded beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams. But in doing so, we have accidentally built a world where they are often safe from the very thing they need most, the presence of a tribe. We have forgotten that for a human being, isolation is the most dangerous predator of all. The ancient world was terrifying, but it was never lonely. Our modern world is safe, but the silence can be deafening. There is a final, sobering truth hidden in the bones of those ancient infants and the stories of the grandmothers who saved them. We have mastered the physical world, but we are still beginners at the social one. We have the tools to keep every child on Earth fed and warm, but we are still struggling to give them the village they were evolved to expect. The history of how we kept our children alive isn't just a record of the past, it's a set of instructions for the future. It's a reminder that no matter how much technology we pile on top of our lives, we are still the same creatures who sat around the fire 200,000 years ago, holding a helpless baby and waiting for the sun to rise. For those hundreds of millennia, the math of survival was simple. One child plus one mother equaled certain death. It took the collective will of the entire group to bring a single life into adulthood. We are the descendants of the ones who understood that the group was the only thing standing between us and the void. We are the ones who kept the embers burning, even when the wood was wet and the wind was howling. We are the survivors of the great gamble, the ones who made the 25% work. When you look at a sleeping infant today, you aren't just looking at a baby. You are looking at the culmination of a 300,000-year-long relay race. You are looking at the result of millions of hours of shared labor, thousands of grandmothers digging in the dirt, and a countless number of aunts and cousins passing the child from hand to hand in the dark. That child is a living monument to human cooperation. And if we ever forget that, we forget the very thing that makes us human in the first place. I hope this deep time journey has changed how you think about your own family and the world we've built. If you found this exploration of our shared past valuable, consider subscribing to join us for more deep dives into the hidden stories of our species. What part of ancient parenting surprised you the most? Is it the grandmother hypothesis, or the idea of baby bottles in the Stone Age? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We're all part of this ongoing story, and your perspective is an important piece of the puzzle. Ancient humans didn't have monitors or pediatricians or books on sleep training. They had something much more powerful. They had each other. They understood that the only way to protect the future was to hold it together. And as we move forward into an uncertain world, we would do well to remember the heat of that ancient hearth. It is the only reason any of us are here to tell the story. The silence of a modern nursery is not a sign of peace. It is the sound of a 300,000-year-old alarm system screaming that the village has gone missing. For almost all of human history, a baby left alone in the dark was already dead. The fact that yours is still breathing is the only miracle you'll ever need. Your ancestors are watching from the shadows, and they are wondering why it is so quiet. They know that in the dark, the only thing that keeps the monsters away is the sound of other people. Nature does not care about your independence.